The Hindenburg was a technological marvel in the 1930s. It was the largest airship ever built and the pride of Nazi Germany. The airship was massive, just 80 feet shorter than the Titanic. It sailed over the skies just like a massive ocean liner. And just like the Titanic, the Hindenburg would go down in history for the horrific disaster that people remember her by. Flight had already been conquered by 1783 by two French brothers in a balloon. The flight lasted 10 minutes in a balloon made from silk and paper. The world's first steerable airship was flown in 1852 by French engineer Henry Guilford. He used a hydrogen-filled envelope with a 250-pound 3-horsepower steam engine. It was steered by a sail like a rudder. It took Henry 3 hours to go just 17 miles in his airship. But during the return flight, the airship's engine could not overcome the oncoming winds. The first successful Zeppelin flight was LZ-1 in 1900. This was the debut of Zeppelin airships. The flight took place at Lake Constance near Friedrichshafen, Germany. And the most famous first flight was brothers Wilbur and Orville Wright on December 17, 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The flight lasted just 12 seconds, but the two brothers made history in flying the first controlled flight in an airplane. Airplanes were in their infancy until World War I, when planes turned from handmade cloth-covered wood frames into steel-tubed fuselages by the end of the war. LZ-128, later known as Hindenburg, was proposed after the successful Graf Zeppelin World Tour in 1929. The flight took 21 days, 7 hours, and 34 minutes, and was the first flight to take passengers around the world. This was a huge news story and a success for the Zeppelin company. The Hindenburg was designed to use hydrogen until the British airship R-101 disaster in 1930. After the crash, the Zeppelin company redesigned the Hindenburg to use helium. Helium was much more expensive and very rare for the time. Helium was chosen because it is the safest gas to use since it is not flammable. But the United States was the only country producing helium at the time. Plus, it was only being produced in a few oil fields. In the 1920s, the United States banned the export of helium. But the Zeppelin company believed that they could convince America to sell them helium. So they went on with the design. But the Hindenburg would never receive helium from America. It would be forced to use the extremely flammable when mixed with air and much cheaper hydrogen. The Hindenburg was 803.8 feet long, 146 feet tall, and was 105.1 feet in diameter. She held 7,062,000 cubic feet of gas and had 4 Daimler-Benz diesel engines that allowed her to travel at a max speed of 84 miles per hour, over twice the speed of a luxury ocean liner of the time. The Hindenburg had ring structures throughout the airship made from duralumin that were braced by girders. The Zeppelin company actually bought 11,000 pounds of duralumin that was salvaged from the wreckage of the British airship R-101. The gas bags used were a latex design made by Goodyear. Previous bags used were made from the outer intestines of animals. The outer skin of the airship was made from cloth that was coated in dope, making it waterproof. The Hindenburg was funded with help from the Third Reich, even though the head of the Zeppelin company, Hugo Echner, disliked the Nazis, but they needed funding. The inside of the Hindenburg was very luxurious. It rivaled the luxury liners of the time. The passenger areas were over 2 decks. A deck held the ship's dining room on the port side with silk wallpaper covered in paintings. The lounge was on the starboard side of A deck. The walls were covered in a mural that showed the routes of famous explorers and the routes of Germany's ocean liners and airships. The furniture and carpets were brown and made from the same lightweight aluminum. To lighten weight, the lounge held a piano made from duralumin on its first season. 25 double-berth cabins were at the center of A deck that could hold 50 passengers. They were small, around 78 inches by 66 inches. The walls were foam covered in fabric. The rooms held bunks. The top bunk could be folded away during the day. They also did not have a toilet. They were on B deck, along with one shower that had very little water or pressure. On B deck, there was the smoking room. It seemed odd to have a smoking room on a massive airship filled with highly flammable hydrogen, but it was the 1930s when everyone smoked, so they designed the room to be pressurized with a double-door airlock. The passengers were not allowed to board with matches or lighters. Only one electric lighter was provided for the smoking room. The room was closely watched to make sure no one left the room with a cigar or a cigarette lit. You could only enter the smoking room from the bar. Drinks were served here and parties were held for the passengers. Extra cabins were added to B deck after the 1936 season. Also on B deck was the kitchen, dining areas, reading room, passenger lounge, promenade, officers' mess, crew's mess, pantry, and steward cabin. The crew areas were mainly along the keel, the officer and crew sleeping quarters, radio room, electrical room, cargo areas. The control car was under the ship. The Hindenburg's maiden test voyage was March 4th, 1936. 87 passengers and crew were on board. The name Hindenburg was written in red letters, nearly 6 foot tall on the hull. The Hindenburg's first formal flight was a sort of Nazi propaganda tour around Germany. The Hindenburg then began transatlantic passenger flights to Brazil and America for its 1936 season, along with the mail that she carried. The first flight was to Rio de Janeiro. She would make 10 trips to America and 7 trips to Brazil in 1936, carrying over 3,500 passengers. After the 1936 season, more passenger cabins were added, increasing the passenger capacity to 70. A one-way flight on the Hindenburg was $450 in 1937, equivalent to over $9,800 today with inflation, making rich passengers the only ones that could afford to pay the high ticket price. The Hindenburg started its last flight on May 3, 1937. She carried 36 passengers and 61 crew, 97 people in total. The trip was from Frankfurt, Germany to Lakehurst, New Jersey. The Hindenburg took off from Frankfurt Airfield at 7:16 p.m. She was delayed over the Atlantic since she had to fight against strong headwinds. Her initial arrival time was 6 a.m. on May 6th. This was postponed to 6 p.m., 12 hours late. This delay added pressure on the crew to make up time, since they would be picking up passengers and returning to Europe for the coronation of King George VI. The Hindenburg reached Boston at 12 p.m. and headed down the coast. They reached New York by 3 p.m. The passengers flooded to the windows to look out over the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Thousands of people flooded the streets in New York to get a look at the Hindenburg. The Hindenburg reached Naval Air Station Lakehurst at 4:15, but the weather was too bad to land. Captain Max Pruss received a message from the commanding officer at Lakehurst, Charles Rosendahl. He suggested that they wait until the weather improved before attempting a landing. So the captain took the Hindenburg over the Jersey shore to wait out the weather. At 6:12, Rosendahl radioed that the conditions were suitable for landing. At 6:22, he recommended landing now. The Hindenburg headed back to Lakehurst shortly after 7. The Hindenburg made its final approach at 600 feet. Captain Pruss made a wide left turn to position the Hindenburg into the wind. The airship was heavy in the rear at this point. They valved hydrogen from the cells to level out the airship, but this failed. She was still heavy in the rear. Water ballast was dropped from the tail, and more hydrogen was valved from the bow to try to level out the ship. But still, the Hindenburg was not leveling out. 6 crew members were ordered to go to the bow to try to level out the ship. The ship then made a sharp S-shaped maneuver towards the mooring mast. It's believed this sharp turn was made in fear of the weather turning and wanting to land as fast as possible. When the airship was positioned above the mooring mast at 7:21, her mooring lines were dropped. Rain started to fall as the lines dropped. A few minutes later, 2 witnesses saw fabric fluttering in the front of the fin at the top of the airship. At 7:25, flames erupted near the ventilation shaft in between cells 4 and 5. Radio broadcaster Herb Morrison described the horrific scene as it happened.
It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's rising terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, the flakes 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I told you, I can't even talk to people. His friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen.
The fire quickly spread at the tail of the airship. The nose of the ship began to raise up. Passengers and crew were thrown across the ship, against walls and anything stationary. Passengers toppled over one another. The Hindenburg was completely engulfed in flames within 34 seconds. Passengers and crew began jumping out of the promenade windows, but almost all who were deeper in the ship, either in their cabins or along the keel, died in the fire. The ground crew ran for their lives as the flaming Hindenburg came down to the ground. Most of the passengers on the starboard side were killed. The way the Hindenburg crashed made escape difficult for those on that side of the airship. 14-year-old cabin boy Werner Franz had a water tank burst above his head, putting out the fire around him. He opened a hatch and jumped out and ran to the starboard side, but the flames made him turn and run the other direction. He survived. There were 12 crew members in the bow. Only 3 survived. 13 passengers and 22 crew were killed in the fire, along with 1 man from the ground crew. The cause of the fire has been debated even to this day. Sabotage was looked into after the disaster. Many believed passenger Joseph Spa, also known as Ben Dova, was a performer and an acrobat, and was considered a suspect by the FBI until he was cleared as a suspect. He was allowed in restricted areas because he had his pet dog, a surprise for his family on board. The dog was held in a restricted area, and he was allowed to feed the dog as long as he was accompanied by a crew member. But it was reported that he made multiple trips into restricted areas without a crew member present. Eventually, he was not considered to have anything to do with the cause of the fire. It was reported that he told an anti-Nazi joke during the flight. This may be the reason fingers were pointed in his direction. He had a video camera on board, and his footage survived the crash. He smashed a window open with the camera he was using to film the landing, and used his acrobat skills to roll and survive the fall. There are many theories about the cause of the fire, but some of the biggest and most believed at the time was that hydrogen gas started leaking and a spark ignited the gas. Witnesses did see fabric fluttering on top of the ship before the fire started, as well as the airship being tail heavy while trying to land. The storm may have caused static electricity, and once the ropes were dropped, The water from the rainstorm soaked into the ropes and allowed a spark to ignite the highly flammable hydrogen-air mixture. The theories go on. There have been multiple tests done by scientists in documentaries about the disaster that are very interesting. They go over multiple different theories. 36 people were killed in the disaster out of the 97 people on board, including one ground crew member. Most of the survival stories are incredible, and an entire video could be made about any of them. I want to thank you all for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed this one, and we will see you on the next. Peace.